The questions didn't arrive quietly. They didn't trickle in one at a time. They hit all at once, from every direction, and once they started, there was no stopping them. GoFundMe links, Cash App screenshots, claims of hacked accounts, accusations of money changing hands without explanation. And threaded through all of it, one name that never seems to escape the spotlight for long: the Whittaker family. For months, many people believed the story had settled. The state stepped in. Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine were removed from the home. Betty was no longer living the life people had grown used to seeing on camera. The videos slowed down. The updates became vague. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the chaos might finally quiet down. But it didn't. Instead, a new wave began, and this time, it wasn't driven by shocking footage or viral clips. It was driven by questions. Questions about money. Questions about who was speaking for the family. Questions about why fundraising pages appeared and disappeared. And perhaps most unsettling of all, questions about relatives who were suddenly resurfacing after years of silence. At the center of it all sits a simple but uncomfortable reality. When money enters a story built on vulnerability, nothing stays simple for long. The Whittakers have always existed in a complicated space. To some, they are a family that represents generational poverty and isolation. To others, they are symbols exploited by outsiders for views, clicks, and revenue. But regardless of where someone falls on that spectrum, one thing is undeniable. Their name carries weight online. And where there is weight, there is opportunity. Over time, multiple fundraising efforts have been associated with the Whittakers. Some were clearly labeled. Some were shared by people claiming to help behind the scenes. Others appeared with little explanation at all. And while many donors believed they were doing the right thing, helping a family they had come to care about, very few ever received clear answers about where their money actually went. That lack of clarity is where the current explosion begins. Screenshots started circulating. Messages where people claimed their platforms were hacked. Statements insisting that GoFundMe pages were created without permission. Others saying accounts were used in their names but not controlled by them. And mixed into all of this were heated arguments between people who, at one point, claimed to be on the same side. The story stopped being about help and started being about accountability. As donors began asking for receipts, timelines, and explanations, something else happened almost simultaneously. Relatives who had been absent for years began to reappear. Some showed up in comment sections. Some appeared on live streams. Others were mentioned in conversations that raised more questions than answers. Where were they before? And what role, if any, did they play in what was happening behind the scenes? For a long time, one of the most common criticisms surrounding the Whittaker situation was the absence of extended family. Viewers asked why no one stepped in earlier. Why no aunt, uncle, cousin, or sibling seemed willing or able to help. That absence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped strangers, creators, and self-appointed advocates. Now, that vacuum appears to be shifting. Names that hadn't been spoken publicly before are suddenly being discussed. Stories are being told that contradict earlier narratives. Claims are being made that some relatives tried to help quietly but were ignored, blocked, or pushed aside. Others insist they stayed away deliberately, believing that stepping into the public circus would only make things worse. And hovering over all of it is the same question that refuses to go away. If money was raised in the name of the Whittakers, who controlled it and who benefited? The answers, so far, have been anything but straightforward. Some insist that funds were split according to private agreements. Others argue that no such agreements were ever clearly communicated. Some claim that money had to be handled carefully to avoid disrupting benefits or triggering state intervention. Others say that explanation is nothing more than a convenient shield used to deflect scrutiny. And then there are the claims of hacking. Social media accounts allegedly compromised. Platforms allegedly taken over. Fundraisers allegedly created without consent. In a digital world where proof should be easy, clarity remains elusive. Screenshots circulate, but context is missing. Statements are made, but documentation rarely follows. As frustration grows, the tone of the conversation has shifted. What was once sympathy has hardened into skepticism. People who donated in good faith now want to know whether they were misled. And people who once defended the loudest voices in the story are beginning to ask whether loyalty blinded them to red flags. But perhaps the most emotionally charged development is the resurfacing of relatives who say they were never given a real chance to help. Some claim they reached out privately and were turned away. Others say they offered resources, housing, or support but were told it wasn't needed. A few suggest that keeping the family dependent on outside creators was more profitable than allowing relatives to step in quietly and resolve things out of the public eye. Those claims strike at the heart of the entire controversy. Because if true, it means the chaos wasn't just accidental. It was maintained. At the same time, not everyone is convinced. Critics point out that resurfacing now, when attention and outrage are at their peak, raises its own questions. Why speak up only after the situation exploded? Why not come forward sooner, before the cameras, the money, and the investigations? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Family dynamics are rarely simple, especially in families shaped by trauma, poverty, and public scrutiny. Silence can come from fear as much as from indifference. And stepping into a viral narrative can feel more like walking into a fire than offering help. Still, the timing cannot be ignored. As GoFund questions multiply, and as more people demand transparency, the reappearance of missing relatives adds another layer of complexity. It challenges the idea that outsiders were the only option. It complicates the image of saviors stepping in where no one else would. And it forces a reckoning with the uncomfortable possibility that control, not care, may have shaped some decisions. What happens next will matter more than any accusation or defense offered so far. Will full accounting ever be provided? Will donors see clear documentation of how funds were used? Will relatives be allowed to step forward without being drowned out or discredited? And most importantly, will the Whittakers themselves ever have full agency over their own story? For now, all that exists are fragments. Screenshots without context. Claims without confirmation. Emotions without resolution. And a growing sense that the story people thought they understood is far more complicated than it ever appeared on camera. The questions aren't going away. They're multiplying. And as more voices resurface, the pressure to answer them is only just beginning. What do you think is really happening behind the GoFund questions and the sudden resurfacing of relatives? Share your thoughts below and let's talk about it. As the questions around fundraising grew louder, something else became impossible to ignore: the way information itself seemed to be controlled. Not just money, not just access to the family, but the flow of narrative. Who was allowed to speak? Who was believed? And whose voice was quietly drowned out or dismissed as irrelevant? For a long time, the story of the Whittakers moved in a straight line. A few familiar faces posted updates. A few familiar names spoke on behalf of the family. Viewers learned to recognize who was involved and who wasn't. Trust formed not because of proof, but because repetition creates credibility. When the same people tell the same story often enough, it starts to feel true. But once fundraising questions exploded, that structure began to fracture. Suddenly, people who had been silent were talking. And people who had always talked were struggling to keep control of the conversation. One of the most unsettling realizations for many viewers was this: most donors had never interacted with the Whittakers directly. They interacted with intermediaries. Messages, updates, emotional appeals, and explanations all passed through someone else first. That middle layer became the voice of authority, even though it was never formally appointed. And when that authority was questioned, the response wasn't transparency. It was defensiveness. Explanations changed depending on the audience. To some, the issue was hacking. To others, it was misunderstandings. To others still, it was malicious rumors spread by jealous outsiders. Each explanation contained just enough truth to sound plausible, but none of them resolved the central concern. Where did the money go, and who decided how it was used? At the same time, resurfacing relatives began telling stories that challenged the idea that the Whittakers had no one else. They spoke of attempts to help that never made it online, of conversations that happened privately and were shut down before they could go anywhere, of feeling pushed out of a process that had become less about family and more about management. Some said they were told staying away was better for the family. Others claimed they were painted as unstable, unreliable, or dangerous simply for asking questions. In more than one case, relatives said they stopped trying not because they didn't care, but because every path forward was blocked by someone else already standing in the spotlight. That raises a difficult question. When does advocacy become ownership? Helping a vulnerable family is one thing. Becoming the gatekeeper to their relationships, resources, and story is something else entirely. And once fundraising enters the picture, that line becomes dangerously thin. Several donors have now said the same thing. They didn't mind giving. What they mind is not knowing. Many said they would have continued to donate if there had been consistent updates, itemized expenses, or even a basic breakdown of how funds were being allocated. Instead, what they saw were vague reassurances and emotional appeals, followed by silence when specifics were requested. That silence fueled suspicion. As pressure mounted, the language used by those closest to the fundraising efforts shifted. Critics were labeled haters. Questioners were accused of harming the family. Calls for accountability were framed as attacks. The focus moved away from answering concerns and toward defending reputations. And in that defensive posture, the Whittakers themselves seemed to disappear. Betty's voice, when it surfaced, often felt filtered. Statements attributed to her raised questions about who helped write them, who encouraged them, and who benefited from them being shared. Some viewers felt the words reflected her feelings. Others felt they reflected the priorities of the people around her. The absence of Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine from public updates only deepened the unease. Their removal from the home was supposed to be about safety and care. But for an audience that had grown used to constant visibility, that absence became a blank space filled with speculation. Who was speaking for them now? Who was making decisions? And who, if anyone, was checking the checkers? Meanwhile, the resurfacing relatives didn't just question money. They questioned motives. They asked why certain people seemed determined to stay involved even when scrutiny increased. Why stepping back was framed as abandonment instead of accountability. Why help always seemed to require cameras. Those questions cut deep because they force a reevaluation of everything that came before. If the goal was truly to help the Whittakers live better lives, then at some point, the spotlight should have faded. The content should have slowed. The dependency on online audiences should have decreased. But instead, attention remained central, even as circumstances worsened. That contradiction is what many people are struggling to reconcile. Another uncomfortable truth began to surface. Once a story becomes profitable, stepping away from it costs something. Views drop. Donations slow. Relevance fades. And for people whose platforms grew alongside the Whittaker narrative, letting go meant losing more than just a cause. It meant losing momentum. This is where missing relatives re-enter the story in a meaningful way. Their presence represents an alternative path. One where help happens quietly, where support doesn't require live streams, where money doesn't need to be funneled through third parties with platforms. That alternative threatens the existing structure. It also explains why some relatives claim they were treated as obstacles instead of allies. Their involvement complicated the narrative. It introduced accountability that couldn't be managed through comments or moderation tools. And it raised the possibility that the family might regain control over their own story. For some viewers, this realization has been sobering. They've begun questioning not just the people directly involved, but their own role as an audience. Did curiosity cross into entitlement? Did support become spectacle? Did good intentions help create a system that rewarded exposure over resolution? These questions don't have easy answers, but they matter. Because at the center of all this are real people whose lives didn't pause when the cameras did. People who now have to navigate fractured family relationships, public scrutiny, and the fallout of decisions they may not have fully understood or controlled. As GoFund questions continue to explode, the pressure is no longer just on the individuals who handled money. It's on the entire ecosystem that allowed this situation to grow unchecked. Platforms that profited, audiences that consumed without asking enough questions early on, and systems that failed to protect vulnerable people from becoming brands. The resurfacing relatives may not be perfect. Their timing may be messy. Their stories may conflict. But their presence forces a reckoning with a narrative that once seemed settled. The story is no longer about whether help was needed. It's about how that help was structured, who controlled it, and whether the family's best interests were always the priority. And until those questions are answered clearly, the controversy isn't going anywhere. Because once trust is broken, reassurance isn't enough. Only transparency is. Do you think the fundraising questions are really about money or about control of the Whittaker story? Share your perspective in the comments and join the discussion. By the time missing relatives began resurfacing publicly, the conversation had shifted from curiosity to confrontation. What once lived in comment sections and private messages was now spilling into live streams, reaction videos, and long threads dissecting every statement that had ever been made about the Whittakers. The story was no longer just emotional. It was structural. People weren't only asking what happened, they were asking how this was allowed to happen. One of the most revealing aspects of this phase was how quickly alliances formed and hardened. Viewers chose sides. Creators defended their positions. Former supporters became critics overnight. And in the middle of it all sat a family whose daily reality had little to do with algorithms, reach, or engagement metrics. What became clear was that this wasn't just a fundraising issue. It was an ecosystem problem. Multiple individuals had, at different times, presented themselves as the primary bridge between the Whittakers and the outside world. Each claimed they were acting in the family's best interest. Each used language like protecting, advocating, and helping. But none of those roles came with formal oversight. No contracts made public. No independent audits. No third-party accountability. And when relatives began to surface asking why they had been excluded, the answer was rarely direct. Some were told it was for safety. Others were told it would confuse things. A few were accused of wanting attention or money. But the pattern was consistent. Involvement outside the established circle was framed as a threat, not a resource. That framing matters because it reveals how tightly controlled the situation had become. In healthy support systems, more help is welcomed. More eyes mean more accountability. More voices mean fewer blind spots. But in this case, additional involvement seemed to destabilize the structure rather than strengthen it. Because the structure wasn't built around collective care. It was built around centralized control. As more information surfaced, donors began comparing notes. Screenshots were shared. Timelines were reconstructed. People noticed inconsistencies in how amounts were described, how needs were prioritized, and how outcomes were reported. Some donors said they were told money was earmarked for specific purposes that never materialized. Others were confused about why new fundraising campaigns appeared while old goals remained unmet. When these questions were raised publicly, the response was rarely clarification. More often, it was emotional redirection. Don't you care about the family? This is hurting Betty. Why are you attacking people who are trying to help? Those statements effectively shut down discussion by reframing accountability as cruelty. And for a long time, that worked. Many people stayed quiet because they didn't want to be seen as contributing to harm. But silence doesn't resolve problems. It just delays them. As the noise grew louder, another uncomfortable truth emerged. Some supporters had begun to conflate criticism of intermediaries with criticism of the Whittakers themselves. That false equivalence made it difficult to separate concern for the family from concern about how their story was being handled. Missing relatives complicated that equation further. Their accounts didn't always align with the dominant narrative. Some described long-standing family dynamics that contradicted the image presented online. Others spoke about decisions being made without consultation. A few said they didn't recognize the version of events being shared in public spaces at all. These discrepancies forced viewers to confront a hard reality. The story they thought they knew was incomplete. And that incompleteness wasn't accidental. In many ways, the Whittaker situation mirrors a broader trend in online advocacy. Vulnerable individuals become symbols. Their stories are simplified for consumption. Their complexity is flattened into something shareable. And once that happens, the narrative becomes more important than the people inside it. That's why resurfacing relatives are often seen as disruptive. They bring nuance. They challenge emotional clarity. They ask inconvenient questions. They also bring history. History is messy. It doesn't fit neatly into donation buttons or content schedules. It requires context, patience, and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about responsibility, boundaries, and consent. Consent, in particular, became a major point of contention. Viewers began asking whether the Whittakers truly understood the scope of what was being shared on their behalf, whether they comprehended how money was being raised in their name, whether they had meaningful input into decisions that affected their lives, or whether those decisions were made for them, not with them. Those questions grew louder after APS became involved. The moment state agencies entered the picture, the stakes changed. This was no longer just an internet story. It was a legal and ethical matter. And yet, online behavior didn't shift accordingly. Content continued. Speculation increased. Opinions hardened. Some creators claimed they were filling a gap left by authorities. Others argued they were documenting injustice. But documentation without restraint can quickly become exploitation, especially when the subjects have limited capacity to advocate for themselves. That tension lies at the heart of this controversy. The Whittakers were never just a family. They became a project. And projects attract managers. Managers decide what's shared, what's withheld, and what's emphasized. They control messaging. They mitigate risk, not necessarily for the people involved, but for the continuation of the project itself. That's why GoFund questions didn't just challenge finances. They threatened the legitimacy of the entire operation. Because once money enters the equation, intentions must be proven, not assumed. As missing relatives continue to speak out, they introduce an alternative accountability framework, one rooted in kinship rather than platforms. They may not have perfect solutions. They may disagree among themselves. But their involvement challenges the idea that the Whittakers needed to be mediated by outsiders indefinitely. That challenge unsettles people who built identities around being the helper. It also unsettles audiences who invested emotionally in a particular version of the story. Letting go of that version requires humility. It requires acknowledging that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. And it requires accepting that helping someone doesn't entitle you to control their narrative forever. This phase of the story is uncomfortable because it forces reflection. Were boundaries respected? Was transparency prioritized? Were the Whittakers empowered or managed? Those questions don't accuse. They invite evaluation. And as long as they remain unanswered, the controversy will persist. Because what's really exploding right now isn't just GoFund questions. It's the assumption that visibility equals virtue, that proximity equals righteousness, that speaking for someone is the same as standing with them. The resurfacing relatives remind us that families exist beyond the frame, that care doesn't require an audience, and that sometimes the most ethical thing a helper can do is step back. Whether that will happen here remains to be seen. Do you believe online advocacy crossed into control in the Whittaker case? Or was it the only way help was possible? Share your thoughts in the comments. By the time the dust began to settle, one truth stood out more clearly than any accusation, defense, or counterclaim. The Whittaker story was no longer just about a family in crisis. It had become a mirror reflecting how online audiences, creators, and self-appointed advocates behave when vulnerability turns into visibility. What unfolded next wasn't a single revelation, but a slow reckoning. As GoFund questions multiplied and resurfacing relatives continued to speak, many longtime supporters experienced something uncomfortable: doubt. Not the hostile kind, but the quiet kind that creeps in when narratives stop lining up. When timelines don't match. When answers feel rehearsed instead of direct. When explanations create more confusion than clarity. For some viewers, this led to anger. For others, withdrawal. And for a growing number, it led to reflection. Because the hardest realization wasn't that mistakes may have been made. It was that the system itself incentivized those mistakes. Online platforms reward urgency, not patience. Emotion, not nuance. Visibility, not restraint. In that environment, stories like the Whittakers are almost destined to be oversimplified. Complexity doesn't trend well. Silence doesn't monetize. And stepping back rarely earns praise. That doesn't automatically make everyone involved malicious. But it does mean that good intentions can be slowly reshaped by incentives until outcomes no longer resemble the original purpose. One of the most damaging dynamics to emerge was the erosion of trust between viewers themselves. Supporters turned on each other. Longtime donors accused newer ones of being naive. Critics were labeled heartless. Defenders were accused of blind loyalty. Entire comment sections became battlegrounds, less focused on the Whittakers' well-being and more on winning arguments. In that noise, the family's actual needs became harder to hear. Meanwhile, missing relatives continued to raise questions that went unanswered. Why were some family members excluded from decisions? Why were reunification efforts so unclear? Why did communication appear to funnel through a small number of gatekeepers rather than expanding as support grew? These weren't abstract concerns. They went to the heart of autonomy. When vulnerable people become dependent on intermediaries for housing, food, transportation, or access to loved ones, power dynamics shift. Even well-meaning helpers can become de facto decision-makers. And without oversight, that power can linger long after it should have been redistributed. That's why transparency matters, not as a punishment, but as protection. Clear accounting doesn't just reassure donors. It protects families from being spoken for without consent. Clear boundaries don't just limit creators. They safeguard dignity. And shared decision-making doesn't complicate care, it strengthens it. One of the most sobering realizations for many viewers was this: If the Whittakers had never gone viral, many of these problems would not exist in their current form. They would still face hardship, yes, but they wouldn't be navigating public scrutiny layered on top of private pain. They wouldn't be dissected in real time by strangers. And they wouldn't be carrying the weight of other people's expectations. Viral attention brought resources, but it also brought control, pressure, and fragmentation. As APS involvement reshaped the family's immediate reality, the online world struggled to adjust. Some creators paused. Others doubled down. A few attempted to pivot narratives, framing developments as proof they had been right all along. But for viewers paying close attention, the pattern was familiar. The story kept being pulled back toward personalities rather than people. That's the danger of centering helpers instead of outcomes. The most important question at this stage isn't who was right or wrong. It's what happens next. What does ethical disengagement look like? How do platforms responsibly step away once professional systems intervene? And how can families reclaim agency after their story has been monetized? These questions don't have easy answers, but avoiding them guarantees repetition. There is also a broader lesson here for audiences. Watching suffering doesn't automatically grant moral authority. Donating doesn't entitle ownership. And caring deeply doesn't excuse refusing accountability. The line between advocacy and exploitation is rarely crossed all at once. It's crossed gradually, one justified decision at a time. For the Whittakers, the path forward will likely be quieter than the story that brought them here. And that may be a good thing. Healing rarely happens under spotlights. Stability doesn't trend. Reunification, when possible, requires privacy, patience, and professional guidance, not constant commentary. For creators and supporters alike, this moment offers an opportunity to rethink what help actually means. Sometimes help looks like raising funds. Sometimes it looks like amplifying voices. And sometimes it looks like stepping back and letting systems, however imperfect, do their work without interference. The resurfacing relatives didn't just complicate the story. They reminded everyone that families are not content arcs. They are living systems with histories, conflicts, and bonds that predate the internet and will outlast it. The GoFund questions didn't explode because people suddenly became cruel or cynical. They exploded because people began asking the questions they should have asked earlier. And while those questions are uncomfortable, they are also necessary. Because the real failure isn't that mistakes were made. The real failure would be refusing to learn from them. If there is any way forward that honors the Whittakers, it starts with humility, acknowledging that visibility changes everything, that power must be shared, and that accountability is not an attack but a responsibility. The story isn't over, but it doesn't need to continue the same way it began. Do you think the Whittaker situation reveals a larger problem with online fundraising and advocacy? Or was this a unique case? Share your perspective in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.